It started with a simple grocery run. No warning signs. No premonitions. Just another ordinary afternoon in the life of Julia Carter. Until she turned the corner of aisle 7 and saw something that made her entire world crumble in an instant. A man stood there, laughing, holding a toddler in his arms. But it wasn't just any man. It was her husband, Daniel Carter, and the woman standing beside him, with her hand resting possessively on his arm, wasn't Julia. For a moment, the world blurred. The hum of the grocery store faded into white noise. Julia clutched the handle of her cart, her knuckles turning white, as her brain struggled to process the impossible. Daniel was supposed to be at work. He had kissed her goodbye that morning, just like he always did. And yet, here he was, holding a child she'd never seen, laughing with a woman she'd never met, acting like a family man. Julia didn't confront him. Not yet. She was frozen, trapped in a cruel moment that felt like a scene from a movie. Her heart pounded, a sickening rhythm that echoed one horrifying question. Who was this woman, and who was that child? For 10 years, Julia Carter believed she had the kind of marriage others envied. She and Daniel had met in college, one of those whirlwind romances where everything just seemed to click. He was charming, ambitious, and the kind of man who made her feel like the only woman in the world. They built a life together, a picturesque existence filled with date nights, weekend getaways, and whispered promises of forever. Daniel's job as a regional sales manager often required him to travel. It was just part of the package. At first, the nights apart were difficult, but Julia adjusted. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He called every night, sent good morning texts, brought back thoughtful gifts from every trip, a necklace from New Orleans, a silk scarf from Chicago, a leather journal from Boston. Little things that made her feel loved even when he was miles away. Looking back, Julia could pinpoint the exact moment when things started to change. It was subtle. So subtle she dismissed it at first. There were occasional missed calls, delayed responses to texts, and vague explanations about late meetings. His work trips became slightly more frequent, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nothing that screamed betrayal. Then came the financial discrepancies. Julia handled most of the household finances, and one day, while paying the bills, she noticed a charge for a second phone line on their account. When she asked Daniel about it, he brushed it off. Work phone, he had said with a casual shrug. It's easier to keep business separate. She had no reason to doubt him. After all, he had never given her one before. She should have looked deeper. She should have asked more questions. But hindsight is always clearer than the present. And so, Julia carried on with her life, completely unaware that the man she shared a home with had another life entirely. Until that fateful day at the grocery store. Standing frozen in the cereal aisle, she watched as her husband, her devoted, trustworthy husband, lifted a toddler into the air, his face lighting up with the kind of joy she hadn't seen in years. The woman beside him, younger than Julia, with wavy brown hair and an easy smile, reached up to ruffle the boy's curls. They looked like a family, because they were a family. Julia barely remembered leaving the store. The drive home was a blur. Her mind raced with questions, her body numb with shock. She didn't cry. Not yet. The weight of the truth hadn't fully settled. Instead, she did what any rational person would do when their world suddenly doesn't make sense. She searched for answers. That night, when Daniel came home, right on schedule, looking as if nothing had changed, Julia forced herself to act normal. She played her role perfectly, smiling through dinner, nodding along as he recounted his busy day at work. She even kissed him goodnight. But the moment he was asleep, she moved. She started with his laptop. It was password protected, of course, but she knew him too well. 3 tries and she was in. What she found made her stomach turn. First, there was a second bank account. Julia had never known about it, and it had thousands of dollars flowing in and out, money she had no knowledge of. Then, there was an email confirmation for a lease on an apartment downtown. The name on the lease wasn't Daniel Carter. It was listed under a different alias, but the emergency contact, that was him. Her hands trembled as she scrolled further. Receipts for expensive gifts. Dinner reservations at places they had never been to together. flight tickets that didn't match his supposed work trips. And then she found the final piece of proof, a birth certificate. Her breath hitched as she read the name, Ethan Carter. Father, Daniel Carter. Her husband had a son, a 2-year-old son. The betrayal hit like a freight train. Every doubt, every suspicion she had dismissed now made sense. She hadn't been crazy. She hadn't been paranoid. She had been lied to. By morning, Julia had made a decision. She wasn't going to confront him right away, not until she had more. Knowing her husband as well as she did, she needed undeniable proof, something he couldn't spin. So she took a personal day from work and drove to the address listed on the lease. The apartment complex was nothing extravagant, but it was nice, respectable, a place where a young family might live. She parked across the street and waited. She felt ridiculous, like some scorned wife in a bad detective novel, but the truth demanded confirmation. Julia had never thought of herself as the kind of woman who could be deceived so thoroughly. She was observant and intelligent, and not one to ignore red flags. But now, as she sat in her car crossing the unfamiliar apartment complex, she realized how blind love had made her. She had spent the night unraveling a life she thought she knew. The birth certificate was proof enough that Daniel had a child, but she needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed to witness his double life firsthand, to watch him walk through that door and step into the role of father to a child she had never met, with a woman she had never known. The street was quiet, the kind of neighborhood where families lived in comfortable ignorance of the secrets hidden behind their neighbors' doors. The apartment complex was well maintained, the landscaping neat, the windows glowing with the soft light of home. Julia gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. How long has this been going on? Had she unknowingly celebrated anniversaries and birthdays while another woman was doing the same? Had she shared a bed with a man who, only days prior, had whispered sweet nothings to someone else? A movement in her rear-view mirror caught her attention. Daniel's car. She shrank back in her seat, her pulse hammering in her ears. He pulled into the lot with an ease that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. There was no hesitation in his actions, no looking over his shoulder, no guilty glances. This wasn't a secret to him. This was his life. Julia watched as he stepped out of the car, a bag of groceries in his arms. He moved with the casualness of a man who belonged here. No urgency, no tension. And then the apartment door opened. Rachel stood in the doorway, beaming at him. She looked younger than Julia, maybe late 20s. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore a comfortable sweater and leggings, the kind of outfit that suggested she wasn't expecting anyone but him. Then came the final blow. A little boy, Ethan, rushed to the door. He looked no older than 2, wobbling slightly as he ran toward Daniel with his arms outstretched. Daniel immediately dropped the grocery bag onto the ground and scooped the child up, laughing as Ethan squealed with delight. He held the boy close, rocking him slightly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Julia felt like she might be sick. She had spent years wondering when Daniel would be ready to have children. They had talked about it, always pushing conversation further down the road. Maybe next year, he would say, brushing a strand of hair from her face, when things settled down at work. It had been a lie. Daniel already had a child. And worst of all, he seemed happy. Rachel kissed Daniel on the cheek, and Julia felt an almost physical pain at the sight. The casual affection, the way they stood together, it was the same way she and Daniel had once been. They looked like a real couple, a real family. Had she ever even been his first choice? Or had she just been one piece of his puzzle, a part of a life that he compartmentalized, shifting between homes like a man switching masks? Julia had her proof now, but it wasn't just about seeing it. It was about feeling it, because knowing the truth is one thing. Living it is another. That night, Julia didn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. He had no idea that she knew. No idea that the walls of his carefully constructed lives were about to come crashing down. For hours, she ran through the confrontation in her mind, imagining every possible reaction he might have. Would he deny it? Would he try to manipulate her? Twist the truth? Make her feel like she was the one overreacting? Or would he finally tell her the truth? By morning, she had made her decision. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to throw things or cry or beg him to explain. She was going to destroy him with quiet, undeniable truth. At breakfast, she went through the motions as if nothing had changed. She placed his coffee in front of him, sat across the table, and waited. When he took his first sip, she slid the birth certificate across the table. Daniel barely glanced at it at first, but as his eyes scanned the document, something in his expression shifted. His fingers tensed around the coffee mug. His breathing hitched. For the first time in their marriage, Daniel looked afraid. "I saw you," Julia said, her voice steady. "At the store, with her, with him." Silence. Daniel's jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward her, searching for something, some sign that he could talk his way out of this. "Julia!" His voice was slow, careful. "I can explain." She almost laughed at how predictable he was. Of course, he was going to explain. Of course. He thought there was still a way to salvage this, to make her believe that she wasn't really seeing what she knew was true. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Go ahead," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Explain how you've been leading two separate lives. Explain how you have a son I never knew about. Explain how you've been lying to me for years." His mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since she had met him, Daniel Carter was speechless. Julia wasn't sure what she had expected. Tears? An immediate apology? Some pathetic plea for her to understand? What she hadn't expected was for him to lean back, rub a hand down his face, and sigh. "I never wanted to hurt you," he muttered. Julia's stomach twisted. "Not I didn't do it. Not this isn't what it looks like. Just a pathetic, resigned confession." She shook her head, exhaling sharply. "That's the best you got?" she asked. "You never wanted to hurt me? Do you even understand what you've done?" Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a brief second, she saw something in his eyes. Guilt, regret, maybe even shame. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he admitted. "Rachel, she was never supposed to be anything serious. It was a mistake at first, but then she got pregnant, and he ran a hand through his hair. I couldn't just walk away." Julia stared at him, disgust curling in her gut. "You couldn't walk away," she repeated, "but you had no problem lying to me. No problem building a life with me while sneaking off to play house with her." Daniel sighed again. "It wasn't like that." "Oh." Julia crossed her arms. "Then what was it like, Daniel?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like that." He opened his mouth, but she cut him off before he could feed her another carefully crafted excuse. "You looked happy," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "At the store. You looked happy with her. With him." Daniel flinched just slightly, but it was enough. He had been caught, exposed, and he knew it. "Was it real?" she asked. "Did you ever love me? Or was I just the woman you settled for while you waited for something better?" "Julia, don't say that," he said quickly. "Of course I love you. This wasn't about not loving you." She let out a bitter laugh. "So what was it about?" "Convenience." Daniel didn't answer, because there was no good answer, no justification, just silence. And Julia knew in that moment that no matter what he said, no matter what excuses he tried to give, it didn't matter. The man sitting across from her wasn't the man she had married. Maybe he never had been. And their marriage? It was already over. When Daniel walked out of the house that night, Julia didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. And she certainly didn't chase after him. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she had confronted him hours earlier, and stared at the untouched dinner plates. The food had gone cold. The house was eerily silent. It was strange how quickly something so familiar could become foreign. She had spent 10 years building a life with this man, a decade of shared memories, whispered dreams, and promises of forever. And now, in the span of a single day, she had uncovered the horrifying truth. It had all been a lie. But as the silence settled around her, something even more painful crept in: relief. Because for the first time in years, She wasn't questioning herself. She wasn't wondering why Daniel had grown distant, why he was always traveling, why he never seemed ready to have children. The answer had been right in front of her all along. She had just refused to see it. Now, there was nothing left to doubt. The next morning, Julia called a lawyer. She wanted everything: the house, the assets, the accounts, anything she was legally entitled to, and she wasn't going to let Daniel walk away unscathed. She spent the next few weeks meticulously gathering evidence: the bank statements, the second phone bill, the emails, the lease for his second apartment. She compiled it all, and when she handed it over to her lawyer, she made one thing clear: she wanted to bury him. And she did. Divorce proceedings moved quickly, largely because Daniel had no real defense. He tried, of course, tried to negotiate, tried to smooth things over, even attempted to apologize. But Julia wasn't interested in his remorse. She had wasted enough of her life on him, and she wasn't the only one. Because while Julia was dismantling her marriage, Rachel was learning the full truth too. One day, as Julia was leaving a meeting with her lawyer, she received an email from an unknown sender. She almost ignored it until she saw the subject line. "I didn't know either." It was from Rachel. The email was short, simple. "Julia, I just found out. He told me you two were separated, that your marriage was over, but the divorce was taking time. I believed him. I feel sick. I don't know what to do, but I just wanted you to know. I didn't know I was helping him lie to you, and I'm sorry. Truly, Rachel." Julia read the email 3 times before closing her laptop, and for the first time in weeks, she cried. Not for Daniel, not for their marriage, but for the sheer weight of it all. For Rachel, for the little boy, Ethan, who had no idea that his father was nothing more than a selfish coward. And for herself, the woman who had spent 10 years loving a man who had never really existed. The fallout of Daniel's deception spread far beyond their broken marriage. His job, the one that required all those work trips, gone. Julia had handed over proof of his fraudulent expense reports to his company. It didn't take long for them to cut ties. Rachel left him too. Turns out, Julia hadn't been the only other woman, just the first. Daniel lost everything: his house, his career, his family. And Julia? She walked away with her head held high, because sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it burns everything to the ground. But from the ashes, she was finally free to rebuild.